I'm going to talk about a couple different things today. One, just a quick intro on who I am. Two, the difference versus engineering and citizen development. How Emprise uses frameworks to bridge the gap between engineering and citizen development. And then I've got a use case that's actually pretty recent for a client out in LA in the healthcare industry. So I want to pull that up and talk through that. We'll do a live demo with that as well. Hopefully that goes well. Real quick, just some quick stuff about me. I've been with Emprise for a little more than 15 years. I like to develop in decisions. I'm a data guy. I care about the data, right? More than anything else, I like to see how the data flows in and out of systems and what that looks like. Outside of work, I've got a lot of gray hair. I've got 3 daughters. I'm a full-time softball coach. Don't tell my boss, and I like to be outside. So where do I fit in with decisions? So I'm from Emprise. Emprise is a partner of Decisions. You guys heard that at lunch. I played many different roles on Decisions projects. I've been a solution architect. I've been a pre-sales engineer. I've done POCs. I've helped with PS. Played a lot of different roles. One of them I like to play a lot is consultant. I like to figure out what people are doing and why they're doing it, right? And how they could do it better. Then lastly, I fell in love with the tool. 4 years ago, I saw the tool, and I'm like, I could build some really cool stuff with this. And I don't have to write all the back-end code to put these designers in front of it. Can someone hit that QR code and see if it actually works? New guy, Tommy, in the PS department, I had him do it, and he somehow stole my identity. I'm not sure how that happened, but I don't know if that actually gets to me or not. If not, we can catch up afterwards. Mark hit on this a little bit earlier. I'm not going to hit on it too long. So Emprise, we're a 50-plus person team based out of Ohio. We do professional services. We don't sell products. We just do services. And services not only in Decisions. Decisions makes up about 15% of the work that we do. We do full stack development and a lot of work outside of the decision space. Decisions is just another tool in our tool belt. All right, let's dive in. How many people have been told Decisions is a citizen development tool? Okay, anyone heard that? I heard that and I laughed. I don't necessarily agree with that all the way. And the reason is because Decisions is hard. It's very powerful. It's pretty great. In my mind, what is Decisions? I think Decisions can provide an opportunity for citizen developers, right, to engage in the development process. The user-friendly designers, right, the rules editors, the flow editor, they're all great. They're easy to use. There are artifacts that can be easily configured, right? You can set up a REST web service. You can set up a message queue. That's pretty easy, right? It's all form-driven, pretty easy to do. You don't have to write all the code to do that. Decisions also has things that allow you to put guardrails in place, design patterns, folder structures, different entity types that allow you to help guide the citizen developer to be efficient and effective within the tool. I think more importantly, or from my perspective, Decisions delivers a lot of power to the engineer, though. Okay, it's an app dev tool. It is abstracted Visual Studio, right? It's C# without having to write any code. So if I can do it in code, I can do it in Decisions. You guys know this already. Decisions, in our practice we've seen, we can build some pretty scalable and optimal solutions that I don't think a citizen developer can just go out and build, right? But we can leverage Decision toolset to get to the citizen developers. One other thing is that Decisions fits or solves a lot of problems that are a bunch of different shapes and sizes. Some of them are simple, approval workflow. Some of them are simple rules applications. Other times it's a completely headless API gateway that's managing all the integration between multiple systems in an ecosystem. Okay, so Decisions itself I don't think is a citizen developer tool, but it can empower citizen development. So let's talk about that a little bit more. In my mind, there's 3 different types of projects that we've run into as a practice. One is just a simple functional workflow. Hey, I've got the travel splash program, right, that we all did in training. I need to have a time off request or a review process or things like that. I may have a static rules scenario where once I build my rule set, I'm not really changing it that much. And if I am, I might be updating a rule table, but the scope of what I'm building is very finite to solve a specific or exact problem. At Emprise, we see a lot of clients who are not doing these two things. They're actually developing a product. And they may be developing a product completely in decisions. They may be developing a product that sits in front of decisions. They may be developing a product that sits behind a CMS but in front of decisions. Right? We see a lot of different use cases. But in those product development use cases, usually what we see is these are software companies trying to build their solution and get it out into the marketplace. Okay, they want to sell to clients, they want to implement, and they want configurations to be put in place so at runtime, the software operates in a way that needs to happen for client A versus client B versus client C. They also have front-end support who wants to be able to onboard the new clients and without releasing code, right, without adding new functionality or new logic. They also have a lot of pieces that intertwine or connect together. We're working with a bank out of Canada right now. They've got 20 different applications that they want built in their entire solution. That's not a simple functional workflow or static rule. You have to understand the whole piece. Okay? So what's the difference between a software engineer and a citizen developer? Many of you probably already know this, but just to rehash it a little bit, software engineers write code, right? They design, they develop, they test. They build software by writing code. Citizen developers extend applications capabilities through configuration, or maybe a no-code, low-code tool set. They have different job titles, right? You got your traditional development job titles in the engineer camp. On the other side, these are your power users. These are the people that understand what's actually going on with the data, but they may or may not have a technical background to actually implement using code. And then lastly, the outputs are very much different. On the software engineer side, they're focused on the technical aspect of it, right? They want to make sure that they're producing scalable code, right? They want to make sure it's optimal, that it performs. That's where they're focused. Citizen developers are focused on solving a problem. They want to get something out there. They don't really necessarily care that it's going to scale or do those things. They want to solve the problem. So how do we bridge the gap between software engineering and citizen development? Right? I've said that decisions, I believe, can be an application development tool, but it can also empower citizen developers. Well, we bridge that gap using frameworks. Okay, so when I think about frameworks, there's a couple different roles that we have to consider. We have to think about the product team, right? The product team ultimately is designing what they believe they're going to be able to take out to the marketplace and sell, right? That's their whole focus. They want to make sure that this product that they're building will interact with some API or some interface with whatever the brain or rules engine or workflow engine is that's behind it. It may be an application layer outside of decisions that they've built, okay? The framework piece sits in the middle here, and the framework's really focused on a couple things. Utilizing core decisions components, right? So a framework should look like any other custom solution built using decisions toolsets. Frameworks utilize reusable components, logging, notifications, messages, stuff like that. A big thing a framework does, though, and probably the biggest thing, is it abstracts the complexity of decisions to sit in the gap for the citizen developer. Okay, and I'll get into an example here in a little bit and what I mean by that. The last piece here, there's always an execution engine, right? So if I have a framework that's sitting in the middle between what the product does and the citizen developer has to have a way to trigger the framework to go do something based on inputs that it's been given. I think we hit on this already. Citizen developers, they want to configure and extend the solution. That's all they want to do, right? They want to onboard new clients. They want to implement new solutions without knowing necessarily how this works. But if they don't know how this works, then this integration isn't going to happen, okay? All right, getting close to some demo stuff here. What are the benefits of utilizing a framework? I think the biggest benefit is a cost reduction. Okay, so instead of, let's take a simple integration use case, right? I want to onboard a new, we do a lot of work in the financial sector, so maybe a credit bureau, right? So you've got different interfaces that go out and look up credit scores or different scoring based on propensity to pay or stuff like that. There's vendor A, vendor B, vendor C, vendor D. If I have to implement all of those end to end every time, that's a lot of development that has to happen. If I have a framework in place, I can implement 1, implement 2, 3, and now it's more rinse and repeat versus actually coding everything end to end each time. We can enforce design patterns, so we can write good code, which means it's stable, it's scalable, it's going to meet the needs. We can make everything configuration-based, right? So my implementation user is doing stuff on the front end through a form or through a web app, as opposed to generating artifacts that we have to release and deploy, right? If we have to release and deploy artifacts, that means we have to wait for a release cycle. So now the pace at which we're onboarding clients or different entities slows way down. The other thing a framework does is it allows us to focus the citizen developer. Instead of having to know all of decisions, they have to know a certain piece or a certain couple pieces, right? So we get to narrow their scope of what they need to know. Last slide, then we get into the good stuff here. How do I know if I have a framework use case? Right, usually our framework use cases, and we've had a lot in the last couple years, we're usually working with a software vendor who's putting out a new product. They're selling to their clients. They want to onboard new clients. The functionality should be the same, however, the inputs may be different. They need to be able to configure those and enable new users quickly without changing the source code, right? That's a good use case for a framework. All right, any questions so far? Anyone fallen asleep yet? All right. So I'm going to talk about a use case. Like I said, I'm not going to read the whole slide to you. We got this healthcare provider or application provider out in Los Angeles, and they came to us and they said, hey, here's the deal. We've got this application, and when we identify that a doctor is looking at a patient, we need to be able to pull that information back, and then based on the user that's using our tool set, needs to go out to any number of external data sources to pull data. Now, each of these external data sources require different inputs. The data they return is different, right? The outputs are different. But we need to be able to push and pull this data in a standardized manner, right? So that was the first requirement. The second requirement was, oh yeah, we've got multiple products. So not only do we have to connect to multiple data sources and add data sources rapidly, we're going to be onboarding new products very rapidly as well. The last piece here is the execution engine at runtime needs to be able to determine, based on this user, am I allowed to execute this integration? Do I have all the right inputs? Have the inputs changed, right? We have to do all that in runtime because we've got a front-end implementation analyst sitting there configuring and onboarding new clients, right? We have to determine are we allowed to execute this piece? So in a terrible picture form, we've got this little spiderweb thing over here. So we've got our framework that sits in the middle. It's got an execution engine. The client has product A, B, and C. They've got different external data sources that they have to integrate with. In this case, they were all REST API. Okay? But product A had to talk to 2 different data sources. Product B talked to 1. Product 3 talked to all 3 data sources. And who knows, tomorrow they're going to say, hey, I've got a new data source. Right? We've got to add it on. We don't want to do any development. We've got to add it on. So we had some design considerations. First and foremost, as a product developer, I've got to be able to tell the decisions developer, I'm going to give you these inputs, I expect these outputs, and these are the different interfaces that we're going to interact with on the REST end. Right? These are the different methods we're going to call. From a framework perspective, which this is the decisions developer, not the citizen developer, the decisions developer who's building the framework, they need to understand what's the data model, right? So many projects start without considering data model first, and they failed pretty quickly. The other thing they need to consider is, well, how can we utilize core decisions artifacts? Because decisions is pretty great. I can build some stuff. But I don't want to train the citizen developer to build all these things. So are there components that maybe we can auto-generate? Right? Can we put the guardrails in place so the citizen developer, instead of playing in this massive sandbox that is decisions, they can play in a small corner of it? And then what kind of logging and visibility do we need, right? With every time we call an external data source, what are the repeatable things that we can do for all of them? So we're not having to build these pieces in each integration, right? Let's abstract that and bring it back to the framework. From an end user perspective, this is one big thing we've learned in the last probably year and a half. What should the user experience be? For whatever reason, being a data guy, I never cared about user experience and what the screen looked like. Clients care about that, right? They want to make sure the screen's pretty and that they're clicking form to form, button to button. We also need to consider, how do we make sure the citizen developers don't break what we've built, right? How do we make sure the solution's stable? All right, we're going to get a little bit deeper in the weeds. So we've talked about 3 different roles here. One is the professional developer, right? The pro developer, we've seen that on different slides before. This is who's building my front end, and it's also who's building my framework. This is the expert in decisions. This is the architect in decisions that's building this. Then I have a citizen developer role who's onboarding new external data sources, right? They're creating to connect to healthcare system A or B or C. That's their job. Then we have the front-end citizen developer who's saying, this organization gets to use this connector. This one gets to use that connector. They have a very much a wizard-driven or form-driven type interaction with the platform here. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on data model, but I think it's important to recognize a few nouns before I pull up the live demo. One is we call these external systems connectors. Connectors have apps, and apps have interfaces. Okay, that's the big data model here. Connectors, you have to be authorized to use a connector. Okay, so a little bit of background about the data model. I don't know if you guys can see the sticky notes on here. They're all folder extensions. Again, another core component within decisions that we're able to leverage to extend our solution without recreating the wheel. All right, I'm going to jump in here. It's a live demo, so things will probably break, which I think is pretty normal, but we'll see what we can do. It's still presenting. All right, you guys seeing decisions? Cool. All right, so in the first session, we talked about this patient lookup application, right? This is the product that our client has. They want to go look up patient data in some system, okay? And so I'm going to talk about that first. So this is the hook that their front end, whether it's in React or Node or Vue or whatever it's in, they're integrating with decisions to execute this function. So they have a patient lookup function that gets patient details. Now, I don't know how many of you guys were at Decisions Days last year, but one of the things we talked about, one of the best practices we have at Emprise is when we have dynamic steps, we change the color of the steps to stick out, right? So this orange box right here, this tells me that, hey, I'm calling the framework. This is a dynamic call. I'm going to pass in a lot of different inputs based on the time at runtime that's going to trigger how this behaves. Okay, so that's a core piece of this, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. I'm going to start really at the highest level at the execution layer, and I'm going to run this for a couple different client IDs. First one ran the next-gen connector. Okay, this isn't going to make sense until I dive a little bit deeper. If I pass in a different ID, right, this is kind of showing I'm a different user, I have different parameters, I'm running a different connector. My core flow that my product is calling, it's abstracted from that. It doesn't know, it just knows that this is who I am, and I need to go execute my process. The framework takes care of the guts that's in the middle, okay? So that's one persona, right? That's one camp. That's the application camp, okay? Let's move into the framework camp. And if I had 3 screens, I would set it up that way because it's hard to navigate and make sense of that. So in what I just did there, I executed 2 different connectors. I executed the next-gen connector for patient lookup. You notice that's the same product, right? That's my hook. And within there, I've got to get patient data. I've got a few other things in here. All right, so these are some core pieces to my framework here for this particular application. I know that for any flow that I'm going to run here, I'm going to have a design pattern, right? And that design pattern is going to expect a patient object, it's going to expect a configuration object, an authorization, and something called a client ID. Okay? This is specific to doing a patient lookup. And what I'm going to get out of it is a list of visit details. So I'm passing in a patient ID. I'm getting a list or an array back of all the times they've been to the doctor in the last 30 days or last 6 months, whatever it is. A few other things you'll notice here is I've got a configuration flow. So this actually initializes a configuration object that tells me or lets me specify the different parameters for, at runtime, what I'm going to be able to pass in to the execution engine. Okay. And then lastly here, I've got the interface. So for this particular app, we implemented one interface, and that interface is the get patient data interface. And within there, this is where my logic is that we'll go out and call some API call and do some stuff, right? This is the piece, this is the small corner of the sandbox that the citizen developer has to play in from a development perspective. The rest of the framework works if they implement this piece, okay? That makes no sense, I'm sure. Let me walk through it. Now let me create a new connector, okay? And kind of show you how the framework works. So I am still, in this case, I'm the citizen developer who's responsible for implementing a new interface. Okay? I'm not the end user who's setting up the authorization to use it. I'm not the front-end application developer. I'm sitting in the middle here, and my boss came to me and said, hey, we have to pull data from Lightbeam. Okay? If we can pull this data from Lightbeam, I need to go find this patient so I can get the details. We have a new requirement, that's what it is. Okay? This is what the process would look like using a framework. I would name my connector, okay, and give it a description. That's going to do something right off the bat. It's going to create 2 things. One is a folder extension, which is a core entity type within decisions. It's also going to auto-generate my REST service. And it's going to stub out my REST service knowing that at a bare minimum I need a base URL. I could stub this out further to have, placeholders for authentication tokens and stuff like that. I didn't take it that far. But I've created the service. So as a developer, once I've got the service, the next thing I need to do is I need to add a method, right? I know that in order to get my patient's data out of Lightbeam, I need to call a specific method. And so here I'm using core decisions, right? I'm going to say get patient data. And maybe it looks something like this. Get data by patient ID. I could train somebody how to do this piece, right? It's a simple form. I could say, hey, you're going to add a new method. These are the fields you're going to add in order to execute or call that external REST method, right? So they save that. Hopefully my syntax is good there. Can't really see it. So just like core decisions, I've got my REST methods in there. Okay, so I've set up the integration, but I've not tied this to my core product yet, right? I've not tied it to my application yet. So if you remember the data model, we had a connector. Connector has apps. Apps have interfaces. So I need to create my app, right? I need to tie this together back to a core piece of my solution here. So I know that I want to tie back to my patient lookup product. Excellent. And what this screen is asking me for is, hey, when we run this, what values do you need for Lightbeam to be able to execute? Well, to call that API, I know I need a base URL. I probably have a client secret. and there's probably some sort of API key. Right? I know that every time I set up a user to execute this interface, they have to give me those credentials because those change from instance to instance, from client to client. So I need to prompt for those. So when I click Save here, this is going to generate our app. And actually what it's doing is it's generating a lot of decisions code for me. Okay, so if I didn't auto-generate code, I have to depend on my citizen developer to understand how my entire framework and engine works. But if I stub it out, now I can say, yeah, cool, man, I've got your flow design pattern, and because it was for patient lookups, these are the inputs that I'm expecting, right? And you're going to give me a list of visit details back. It also goes out and it generates my configuration data structure. So dynamically, I went out and created a data structure that said, okay, this is my configuration object I'm going to pass in. Every time I run this, you're going to get an object of this type that has these attributes. The other thing that happened here is it auto-generated my interface, right? Because I know that I'm creating an integration for that specific app, I know what endpoints need to be called. So I'm going to stub that out so the developer can go in and they can implement the flow, whatever they need to do. Maybe they need to call that REST API that we just had, that we just set up, right? So they're going to go out and say, okay, well, I got Lightbeam. I'm going to get patient data. And I need to give it a base URL. That's going to come from the configuration object that was generated for me. And the patient ID is going to come off the patient because I know that every time I run this application, I'm going to get this data. Right? So as a decisions developer, this all makes sense, and I would set it up from scratch, and I could build it. But as a citizen developer, I'm not going to understand all that. Not without a lot of training. Okay? So we'll go ahead and implement this out a little bit further. We'll just add a pop-up. Now, where's that at? Show pop-up. And I think we said this was Lightbeam. Is that what we used? And we'll just say it worked. Great. I fully anticipate that to error off, but we're going to show the pop-up anyway, just to show that it worked. Okay. So as a citizen developer, I have to implement the actual logic that calls the APIs at the external system and aggregates the data to return back what I need. The only other thing the citizen developer has to do is they have to initialize the configuration flow. And I could probably stub this out further. I didn't get it all the way figured out. But basically, I have to initialize my configuration object, which is really simple. It's here in build data. And if I had default values that every client used, I could pass them in and set it up as my default. So now I've set up my configuration object, and I'm just going to pass that out. Okay. All right, so at this point, I've implemented a new connector and a new interface for that connector specific to one of my product applications. So I've done both. I've done 2 of the 3 roles now. I understand my hooks to my product. I implemented as a citizen developer the integration point, right? That one box that had to be there. The last piece or the last role that I need to be is I need to be the front end implementation analyst. Okay, so this is what their job looks like. This is another way to think about citizen development. I've got a new client, client 4, and they want to use Lightbeam. And they want to use Lightbeam for patient lookup. And their URL is this. And their keys are this. Save it. Done. I've onboarded a new client. I've onboarded a new client to use Lightbeam. So let's go back full circle. Right? So now I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, hey, I'm an application, and I want to run patient lookup for client 4. Right? And what I should get, when I run client 0, I'm not going to get Lightbeam. Next gen, right? Because that client's set up to use that connector. Okay? If I run this again for client 4, which is 0-based indexed here, if this worked, it didn't work in the first session, it should say Lightbeam. Right? So I've onboarded a new client, a new connector. I haven't changed my hook to my product. The product's none the wiser that I've extended the capability of my solution. Okay, so let's abstract this a little bit more. So how do you create the application hooks? The product side. How did I know that for patient lookup I needed a patient and I was going to get back a list of visits? How does that part work? Right? That's a different framework. That's my application framework that's here as well. So we'll make something up. Sure, it will probably fail miserably as well. So I'm going to create a new application. Maybe I want to look up, what do I want to look up? Maybe I want to look up the value of an RV. I don't know. So we'll call this our RV evaluator. I don't know, estimator. I'm terrible at use cases. All right, so I'm creating, so now I'm back to be the application developer, right? We've started a whole new use case, right? So I'm product development now. I know that I need to hit an API that's going to go out and give me, based on some inputs about an RV, it's going to give me the value of this RV, okay? This is a different use case in the same type of framework. So as a professional decisions developer, I need to come in and I need to implement how my product's going to integrate with this. This is not the citizen developer. Okay, so they're going to go in and they're going to say, hey, I have this thing. It's called an RV, and it's got a make, a model, and let's say a year. You know, and if we wanted to pass the same object back, we could say, and it has a value. Okay, which is a decimal. Good enough? So that's our custom object. And I know that my application needs a hook called getValue, right? So I'm going to create my API endpoint for getValue. GetValue. And I'm going to implement some stuff. I saved a template off to just drag and drop on. Okay, and basically at the end of the day, when I run this, I need to make sure that I am trying to get the getValue hook. I also know that in order to run this flow, I need a couple things passed in. I need to know who the client is, right? In my framework, I always need to know who the client is because that's how I drive authorization. And I'm going to get in some sort of RV object. Okay, so that should be right here. All right, so what I've just done there is I've implemented the same framework for that particular application. But if you remember back a couple slides, I said, okay, well, when I'm doing product development, I need to understand the inputs and outputs that I'm given, right? So I need to go set that up. And so I could probably abstract that and put a form in front of it. I chose to implement that, all of you, using truth tables, which could be done dynamically. But I'm going to show you kind of what those hooks look like. Maybe. There we go. So I'm going to get my application ID, and then I'm going to go update my truth tables very quickly. So from an inputs perspective, I know that for that particular application, and again, you could do this dynamically. You don't have to do this manually. I need to pass in an RV. So I'm going to build an array, build data, and the value is going to be RV. And the type is going to be, this little reflection on this metal stand is not good. Constant, sorry. And that's going to also be RV. Okay. So that is the input I need when I build connectors to connect to my application. From an output perspective, I just need the value, right? We said that that's going to be our use case, so I'll go out and I'll add that in. Build array, build data, set the name to a constant. This is going to be value. And I'll go out to type, constant, and this will be a decimal. Okay, so that's the output. And then lastly, I need to understand what interfaces are needed when I create a new RV estimator application, right? So I got that, and I think I call it value. I remember correctly. All right, so from an application developer perspective, I've implemented my new RV estimator. So let's jump back and create a connector for it now. Right, so it's kind of going to bring us full circle. Right, we started with the patient lookup. It was already built. I just built the RV estimator. I'm going to create a new connector. And this is going to be, is there like an auto trader or something? RV trader? I don't know. RV trader. They've got some API we want to get to. It's going to let me create my methods again. This looks familiar, right? Go ahead and add an app. I know that I'm adding an app for RV estimator. And here again, these are my credentials that I need. So maybe I've got the base URL. Maybe I just have an API key here and something else. Okay, don't know what something else is. This is going to go out and it's going to generate all the same artifacts that I need for my framework to still execute. Okay, it's going to go out and generate the data types, the design patterns, but now instead of having a patient and expecting a patient to be passed in, it's going to have my RV being passed in, right? And the outputs of my flows are going to be value instead of a list of visits. You'll notice it auto-generated my interface. This time, instead of get patient data, it's get value, right? Because that's my hook back to my application. I go into my main flow. I should see, I'm going to get an RV in, and output-wise, outputting the value. So I can leverage the same framework for different applications, right? And so we see a lot of use cases where a lot of our clients have very similar pieces. We have other use cases where, right, these are kind of very asynchronous in nature, right? I'm going to make a call to get data, it's going to return something. Like I'm not stacking a bunch of those together. I'm not orchestrating a process. You could add a process orchestration layer on top of this, right? You could do those types of things, but the biggest piece here that I wanted to show was you can dynamically generate decisions code. And by doing that, you can set up a framework for a citizen developer to be successful. So with that, I guess I'll open it up for questions. I think we've got about 5 minutes left. There's a lot there, right? That's many weeks and months of thinking. Yeah? I fully appreciate configurability and letting citizen developer create decisions, design elements. Yes. Yeah. Great question. So just like I can generate all that code, I can generate deployment packages, I can generate documentation packages, I can push that deployment from environment to environment, and I can abstract that from being core decisions capability to being form-driven, right, or wizard-driven. So I can say, okay, if this is ready to move, here's your package, go ahead and move it. Right? They don't have to understand how the designer repo works or the project, the new project stuff coming out in the next version. They don't need to understand how that works because we can abstract that and build that out for them. If so, after production, the auto-generated things wouldn't be launched to a project? They would. And so some of them are. I didn't get fully built out here in my solution. But when I go back out to the connector level and I look at the folder view, let me go into one of these. I'm going to make myself a liar here real quick. List. You notice that each of those connectors that I built, I auto-generated a new project and decisions, and then all my artifacts for that get associated, or should. They don't in this example, but they should get associated, so when it's time, I can export this project and move it through. Yep, so I'm doing it dynamically. All those things that a decisions developer should do, there's a lot, right? There's a lot of really cool stuff, a lot of powerful stuff, but my clients, when they come to me and say, hey, I have citizen developers, they don't understand all that, right? This is software engineering. We're just trying to hide it behind a layer of abstraction. Good question. Yeah?
Less of a question and more of just a, man, I wish this is what they taught me in college, as opposed to JavaScript, because just this brief 45-minute presentation explained object-oriented programming to me, despite this being a no-code/low-code environment. Mm-hmm. It explained object-oriented programming to me in a visual format and explained it and showed how it works so much better than a year and a half of college ever did to me.
Right.
And 5 different classes of JavaScript and Python.
Yep, I get it.
It's incredible to see how simple it is in decisions as well. I've been learning through their hands-on training and their self-paced training, but seeing a professional do it, it's just incredible
Yeah,
to see.
thanks. The power of the tool is really good, right? So, any other questions? Thoughts, comments?
Can we revamp the education system and let the free kids through college
Right?
pay for
Yeah.
your math that was away?
I don't think I get to do that one, but
Thankfully, I got out of it and took an alternative path, and now I'm debt-free and hunting for a job.
nice.
That's why I'm here.
Awesome. Well, that's just an example, right? There's many different ways to abstract decisions code, but just trying to open up the door for possibility as you guys enter into your own projects. So thank you. Appreciate it.